Hello, and welcome to the studio at Global Goals Week 2021. I'm Beverly Goodman, Editorial Director of Investing and Asset Management for Barron's, and I'm here with Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, and Doug Peterson, CEO of S&P Global. Both are leaders in sustainability, leading up huge firms that regularly make the Barron's list of most sustainable companies because of how they approach their stakeholders, not just their investors, but also their employees, clients, and communities. Measuring sustainability and a company's success in meeting environmental, social, and governance goals, known as ESG, has never been easy and in some ways is getting harder today. So let's talk a little bit about why that is and what can be done. So to start, we currently have a hodgepodge of reporting standards, many of them seemingly at odds with one another. How did we get here, and what problem do we need to tackle first? Brian, let's start with you.
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is why we're doing this. We're doing all this reporting to try to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and also to get the private sector to declare how they're making progress so that all their stakeholders can see it. Not only their customers, but their shareholders, their employees, their communities, and it's critical that all that is seen so that your brand advances and things like that. So that's the critical question. Is we have a lot of them because it has been a relatively informal process, and so Doug and his company and many other companies, including Bloomberg and others, have built these things over the Barron's, and others have built this over the years. But the problem is now you have many metrics, and so that's one of the issues we face. But it would be naturally assumed because there's no official sector pronouncement on this area compared to other areas that we deal with.
All right, and Doug?
Yes, I agree with Brian, and well said. And when you think about what the companies are looking at right now, organizations like ours and others that are trying to analyze the data are not seeing it delivered in a consistent way. Companies today report information in their own way. As an example, in the S&P 500, 85% of the companies have some sort of a sustainability report. They provide information about their climate, their water, their diversity inclusion, but only 15% of those companies actually include that information in their financial reports or their statutory reporting. So there's today a lot of the information is self-reported. There's not standards around it, which makes it much harder to use for the financial markets.
So can the needs of all stakeholders, Doug, you mentioned financial markets, so obviously we're talking about investors, but also regulators, advocates, NGOs, can all of these constituents be satisfied with the same reporting standards, or do we need sort of multiple sets of standardization for different use cases? Doug, you run the leading provider of ratings, benchmarks, analytics. You're the perfect person to start with on this one. How could this work?
Well, if everybody was presenting information, the same information in a consistent way, even if it wasn't comprehensive, included everything, but even a start. Last year, there was Brian led a group at the IBC, the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum, and defined 21 metrics, which gave a start for 21 metrics. When you add that into others that are being looked at by groups like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board or SASB, this gives you a foundation of consistent information that organizations like ours could use to build indices or use in ratings. So we have now at our own company put together a group called Sustainable One, and we're gathering all of the information we can get and we're conforming it and making it consistent so we can use it to build indices or ratings or research and information. But it really starts with the standardized disclosure.
Brian, Doug mentioned the Sustainability Accounting Board. I know you've done some work along these lines with them. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it really goes back to a little bit what your earlier question was, which is there was a lot of standards, and so we as the issuers of the world, and so the International Business Council is 130 companies, very large companies from all different parts of the world through the World Economic Forum. And so what we said is, let's try to figure out a way to standardize these metrics that could be across industry, and then also could go into the official reports, as Doug mentioned earlier. So we asked the big four accounting firms to actually go out and do the work and pull together all the metrics and find under each of the pillars of the SDGs, which is where we sort of started saying that's what the world wants us to report on. And then here's the metrics that will give rise to that are the most straightforward ones. Now, beneath those, one of the metrics is TCFD reporting, so therefore that's a lot underneath it, but it requires everybody to do it. So as we standardize those metrics. We now have 100 companies agreeing to disclose them. If you look at Bank of America's annual report and some of my colleague companies, they're already right in the annual report. And that means that, going to Doug's earlier point, there's no informality left to this. This is actually in the annual report. So our diversity metrics, our scope 1, 2, 3 on the environmental side, they're right in the annual report. And the idea we built the metrics was either disclose these metrics or tell us why you can't. In some cases, companies can't because it's not really appropriate to their industry, but that's fine. But it gets everybody in a common playing field. Then underneath that, Doug and his great company and many companies can granularize behind that. But the key is to get everybody to one standard. And some things are very capable of that, i.e. the diversity statistics of your team. That's not a standard which is hard to realize that every company can report on that, versus other ones that are a little trickier, like when you get to scope 3 for certain industries, it gets more difficult.
So are we talking about a global standard here? Like investors, asset managers like BlackRock have been calling for that, for a global framework for ESG reporting. But even basic international accounting standards are tough to enforce and often controversial. Doug, why don't we start with you this time?
Well, when you look at the reporting that's going on right now, as we mentioned, it's very it's very disparate across all the different types of information around the world. There are various initiatives going on, but recently there's a group called the IFRS, or the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, that people are starting to put a lot more effort around what they are going to be working on. They have financial standards for accounting reporting, and they're starting to look at all of the ESG reporting that could become standardized around the world. There's about 10,000 global companies, it's probably a little bit more than that are listed around the world, that are global issuers. They issue debt, they issue equity around the globe. They're part of the global supply chain. If we started with that 10,000 companies, it would allow us to have a way to report and get consistent information around the globe for global financial markets. If you get that kind of standardization coming out for the financial markets for that 10,000, the other companies will start to follow, because they'll say, well, my supply chain, the SME companies I deal with, I'm going to need that information because my bank wants it or the investors want it. So it really starts with getting the largest global companies on a single standard of reporting. And it's really the reporting, it's the disclosure, because out of that disclosure, you're going to see a whole different set of reports, of indices, of research, of ratings, et cetera. So it's going to start with the disclosure. And if you could really focus on a global approach to get that consistency, it will give us a foundation that will really benefit everyone.
So how might we get to this uniform standard on a global basis, and how long will it take? What's involved? Brian?
Well, the first thing is to at least get the issuers and the accounting firms to agree this is a set of standards. And by that, we started with the word we use is convergence. So we work closely with the SASB, as Doug mentioned earlier, and GRI, and a lot of different things to say, hey, let's converge this. And they've worked very well as a group with the World Economic Forum to start to drive that convergence. Think of yourself as IFRS or FASB or other accounting standard setters around the world. If sort of all the relevant parties, the investors, the issuers, the NGOs and others come and say, this is the right set of standards, it makes their job easier. And that's what we're trying to drive. Now, they have to think about how those things can be disclosed upon and reflected upon and signed off on by internal and external auditors and others to make sure they're accountable and across jurisdictions. But the reality is, the more we converge as the interested parties, the easier that job makes to bring it to official sector. But the thing I'd always say is everybody has to back up. When we become about the standards, about the metrics, the real question is, why do you need to do this? We will not get the SDGs implemented unless the private sector uses all their innovation, all their capital, and all their energy to make it happen. Because at the end of the day, it far eclipses, the private sector far eclipses any government's capability of doing this, any philanthropy capability to do this. And if it takes $6-7 trillion a year, it's going to be that private sector, those 10,000 companies Doug talked about, and all their suppliers making the moves that will then drive all of society to it. Without that, it won't happen, or it would have happened already, quite frankly. And the official sector making those reports consistent allows people to judge who's driving, who's doing their fair share, who's making progress, what's the plan they committed to. That's the critical part of the official sector part of this.
So you've both mentioned a need for collaboration among companies, among nations, governments. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Brian, you urged President Trump to remain a part of the Paris Climate Accord, and when he pulled the U.S. out, Bank of America became a signatory itself. You announced earlier this year your plan to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions before 2050. What exactly is the role of business leaders, and what is the role of government in setting these standards around sustainability reporting?
Well, I think the role of business leaders is to lay out a plan, and then to go start executing on that plan, and then make that plan ability to be assessed by all the relevant parties, the investors, the customers, the employees, and society. And that's what the metrics allow you to do. That's how it ties back to you. So in our environmental case, we are net zero by 2050. We will do over the next decade $1.5 trillion of SDG financing, but $1 trillion environmental financing. But that's to help our clients make the transition. Now, how do we impact all that? We work with our mid-sized companies saying, here's what net zero means, and your purchasers of your products, whether they're consumers or companies, are going to require you to do that. So that movement by the private sector to drive the ecosystem, as so-called, forward, is what we've done, and that's why, in the 5 years since Paris, frankly, you've seen major private sector movements, and we need to have governments enable some of those movements. And one of the ways they can enable is by standard metrics. So we spend more energy actually doing the work to make the metrics come true and improve than we do debating about the perfect way to measure something.
So Doug, same question. You've worked extensively with the World Economic Forum. You've advocated for more infrastructure spending in developing countries and tax reform here in the US. So how do you think governments and businesses should be working together, or what is the role of each?
Well, this is ultimately the best opportunity for a public-private partnership. We talk about PPP, and this is a time when we really do need to bring together the best of both. One example is the TCFD, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which has been led by the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, along with the private sector, to come up with standards and a framework for climate reporting. And this is where we can see the two come together. As an example, I'm leading a task force for the G7 to help support the finance ministers of the G7 with a way they can bring their power behind financial reporting and disclosure. But let's take a step back and just think about why we're doing this. On the one hand, you have what we call asset owners, or people that are investors in 401ks or pension funds, or we talk about the people that their funds are ultimately included in large institutional funds which drive the markets. They care today about how their funds are being invested. What are the needs of environmental change, of diversity and inclusion in the funds that they're investing in? They want to know, and they want to see change. And so this is where we can bring that information that allows them to know. So you have the disclosure also that investors will need to be making to their asset owners. One last thing I want to say is related to this. Obviously, each country and each company is different, but we talked about, you just mentioned emerging markets infrastructure. We know that in the United States, we need a major infrastructure investment in our energy grid, in our power grid, in energy generation, in our airports, in our air traffic controller system. We need to find ways to build the infrastructure for electric vehicles. So there's a whole change that we need to make in the United States to rethink our infrastructure and our infrastructure investment so that it will also support renewable energy and a more sustainable future.
Beverly, if I could just hit on that last part of what Doug said is critical, because what is going to drive the demand for that clean energy is the commitments by companies in net zero. And so when a company like ours has this overriding commitment, and then underneath that has specific milestones we can measure, just going to what we spend on power, which is $100-odd million a year, and we've been reducing that through use. But what we've been able to do now is use our purchase power to help create alternative energy supplies by producers who supply to Bank of America for its sources. So that's whether it's solar or wind. On our financing side, because that's going on through lots of companies making those commitments and making those commitments measurable and seeing the progress, we do a tremendous amount of financing into the environment to create more wind and more solar and more alternative energy. So that's what really happens here. So the metrics, company A declares this is how I'm going to get to net zero. Here's my path. The investors can see it, as Doug said, and they can judge them on it, as can their employees and their customers and society. But the key thing then is that brings all this environment to pair with the government's investment in these infrastructure things to drive the change. And that's the piece that we've got to link together, which is the metrics show the company's making progress. The company's making progress, therefore, better investments. If you actually do the math, they're better brands to buy. That then causes activity flow. That then causes more energy to move. But the government's infrastructure is critical to enable the thing to happen behind it. Otherwise, you'll have all this demand and no ability to fulfill it.
So I want to change gears here slightly. These conversations around sustainability often begin with the environment, but the past 18 months in particular have really thrust many social issues into the spotlight, that S in the ESG. We've got the dramatic and widening wealth gap in our country, racial injustice, a lack of access to affordable health care, lots more. So has the role of corporate America changed in tackling many of these social issues? Doug, let's start with you.
Well, obviously, over the last year and a half, we've been dealing with COVID, which in its own way required all of us to rethink our purpose, understanding how we support our employees. And then we had the George Floyd murder, which also brought to the front a whole new consciousness about race in the United States. So our DEI programs also were enhanced. One of the things that I've seen over the last year and a half is a much better coordination and cooperation across the corporate sector than I'd ever seen before. Organizations like the Business Roundtable have put in place task forces to look at diversity and inclusion in the financial markets, in healthcare, in preparing the workforce of the future, ensuring that we have the right education system. So these are ways that I see the corporate sector coming together to learn from each other. As an example, in our own company, we have a very strong set of, we call them employee resource groups. And we've been able to now share and compare with other large organizations. What are the best practices with affinity groups and employee resource groups at other companies? How can we use those, not just in our own company, but across companies to learn from each other? And in addition from that, we can learn more about mentoring, about how we can grow the right kind of careers in our company, have the way that inside companies you can have career paths for people that are completely new ways of doing it. So I'm very encouraged by the cooperation across corporate America that we've been seeing over the last year and a half.
Brian, what do you think the role of corporate America is in addressing some of these social issues?
Well, the phrase that we use in one of the groups I'm working with is Treasurer of the State of Connecticut, Treasurer Wooten. And one of the ways he expressed this is what they call the mirror in the window. So in the mirror, it's how you run your company. And Doug talked about some of that, the diversity from top to bottom, measuring that diversity at every level. We have 7 levels of Bank of America. We measure that diversity, managers versus producers, and every different measure we can. And then making sure your employee base matches society. And then you think about in the mirror, looking at what you do in the company. It's your affinity groups, which Doug mentioned. We have 180,000 teammates in our affinity groups. We had 165,000 participate in courageous conversations about the racial, social justice issues just in the last year. So you have those mirror things, how you use your purchasing power for women minority businesses, $2 billion a year in our case. That's sort of the mirror point. How do you actually run your company to ensure that you're a company of opportunity? Then you look outside, and for a bank, this is partly an element that exists for this industry versus other companies, in what we call the window. And how do you look outside? And one of the things we perceived was the need to drive more capital outside. So we created a $1.25 billion program. We've been implementing it. 400 million is deployed. But where did we find the place that we thought we could help the most? Clearly, in the minority depository institutions, we've invested in 20 of them. Common stocks so they can grow, and that's been a successful program. And then we looked in the private sector, non-banking sector, and we said there's a lack of capital for Black entrepreneurs and Latinx entrepreneurs. So we created a $200 million originally, and now we're over $300 million and growing of capacity in our company to invest in funds run by BIPOC entrepreneurs, investing in BIPOC entrepreneurial companies. So you create a double layer of opportunity outside our company, one for the private equity people, basically, and then second for the actual entrepreneurial companies, and then ultimately to be 3,000 companies invested in. So we feel very good about that program. 100 are signed up. We've invested a few $100 million, committed to $300 million. That program is very successful. That's creating capital outside our company and helping people grow. And then behind that, we did a healthcare, a lot of vaccination clinics, a lot of testing clinics. We did education. We gave away 30 million masks on the healthcare side. Then we have the job side. We're working in our company alone on lots of CEOs across the country in 110 in the Treasurer Wooten's initiative in work we've done a thing called CLC in Charlotte, where we're trying to aim the capacity of our hiring to those high volume jobs where we can bring a person into our company with a career mindset at 18 years old, 19 years old, who's had the right training in high school to come in, and then they can continue to further education through training in the company and outside the company and get on a career path starting at a minimum wage at our company today of $20 an hour, $42,000 a year plus full benefits. And so that's a great career path for people. And so we committed to do that, and that's going on as part of this program and work with a lot of CEOs. So if you think about it, stepping back to concept, companies got to drive what they do, how they're diverse, representative, how they drive social and racial justice within a company, and then they have to look outside and how they can help society create more opportunity. And that's a question of just being, creating that opportunity through capital, and things are harder to get. Our regular way lending and stuff, with the largest lender to small businesses, that's assumed that we have to do that well. Our $5 billion a year in low and moderate income housing, that's assumed you have to do that well. These are special programs to find the places where traditionally the money hasn't flowed as fully.
So it's been a challenging time for all of us. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned, or what has surprised you in the past year or so as we've been dealing with the pandemic and the economic crisis? Doug?
Well, the first thing that surprised me was that we needed to move really fast, and faster than I've ever seen in any crisis before. We had a little bit of time to be able to understand what was going on. In our case, at the beginning of COVID, we put in place a steering committee, immediately started meeting every single day in February 2020 to start preparing for what we weren't certain what it was going to be. But by doing that, we were able to get ahead of all of the different operating issues in the company, how we were able to support our customers, support the markets. We put in place a website with all of the information that we could provide to the markets that we were seeing in the credit markets and the equity markets, the risks that we thought were going to be coming up in the what could become a financial crisis. One lesson we saw was that the financial regulators, as well as the central banks, were able to move really fast and use tools that they had already had in place after the financial crisis. The financial sector was very well capitalized, had excellent liquidity, not necessarily prepared for a pandemic, but because of the learnings from the financial crisis and the stress testing and CCAR modeling that had been done. But what was absolutely probably most important for our company and for me personally was understanding how people have to come first. In our own organization, we saw that we went into a prolonged period of people having uncertainty in their professional lives, uncertainty in their personal lives, working from home, working remotely. And that required us to completely rethink how we treat our people. Understanding it's not only is it the things we talked about before, career and career development, and understanding how people can have the best opportunities possible, but also doing it in a way that showed kindness and recognition that people have other lives. We have people who have children who weren't going to school, so it ends up they become teachers at home. People who are having to take care of elderly parents or the extended household, while trying to also juggle a job. And some of that led to issues with wellness and mental health that we had to think about. So we put our people first. It meant that we changed a lot of our policies on leave, on sabbaticals, on how we think about the organization in terms of healthcare support, mental health support. But for me, probably the most important lesson was we have to put our people first.
That is an important lesson. Brian, anything to add? What you learned, what surprised you the most as we've navigated these tough times?
Well, I think we basically started off with a teammate-centric and then customer-centric view of what we needed to do, and then ultimately, after the George Floyd killing, it became a society-centric view because of the demands that came out of that horrible situation. But this past weekend was 9/11 in New York, and I actually I was actually reflecting on the lessons I learned as a leader 20 years ago and what we found, and a similarity to that of some of the ways we took on the pandemic, which was first to make sure people are comfortable. And so, as Doug talked about, we had 180,000 people we had to get to work from home that hadn't worked from home traditionally. And then the first thing we went to is the schools, shut down, the kids were home, and suddenly you had a worker for us was also at the same time a tutor, a hall monitor, a IT professional, and all that stuff at once. And so what we said is they need help. So we said you can have $100 a day to hire somebody to come in your home. It can be your cousin, it can be anybody to help you so you could work effectively while your kids would have been in school and help your kids make progress, because obviously parents were very worried about that. So we started that program. We've had almost 4 million days bought through that program, or $400 million over the last year. That was critical to stabilize people, and also, frankly, as Doug said, to help with the mental. And then this mental, because the worry went through the roof. I'm worried about getting sick. I'm worried about my kids getting sick. I'm worried about my kids losing a year. So we took a teammate centric. And then the second thing is, because of what we did and the stability and 10-decade of responsible growth and how strong we were, suddenly we became, our industry and our company became very needed to help deliver part of the structure of what was going on. So we had $70 billion of borrowing instantaneously, from companies who needed liquidity. We had to stand up the PPP program, which ultimately had 10,000 people working on it, volunteering on the weekends. People who had never worked in it before stepped up and volunteered to help us get that through. Then we had the 2 million consumer relief requests we had come in. And so as ebbs, the customer side came through maintaining liquidity in the markets, but also just helping individual consumers through this unknown period. And then you move to the $1.25 billion program and the conversations around that, which were going on at the same time. And so I think all the things we did were wonderful, and the team did a spectacular job managing through it. But you had to come back and have a set of principles, which was make sure our teammates on a people-centric, teammate-centric view, make sure we took care of our customers, and then make sure we helped with society when it got there. But the real question of all that became possible was the capabilities of our company, the stability, and it was never an issue about our company's liquidity or solvency or anything like that, which was the financial crisis. This was step back, you have the capital, you have liquidity, you can do your job and actually help the central banks in the fiscal side get through the system. And the team did a fantastic job, and I couldn't be prouder.
Sadly, we have to leave it there. I want to thank you both for your expertise, your insights, and for joining us today at the studio. My thanks to Brian Moynihan, CEO of Bank of America, and Doug Peterson, CEO of S&P Global. And I'm Beverly Goodman of Barron's. Thank you for watching the studio at Global Goals Week 2021.